All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. This is going to be Macroeconomics Chapter 6. So if you want to take a moment to pause me and pull out your notes from the Files section in Canvas so that you can sort of follow along, we'll go through the notes on the chapter, and then I'll discuss some other research and some things that sort of tie into what we're talking about in the chapter. So I'll give you this opportunity, and here we go. Also, I posted the exam. It's also under your files. It will only be inclusive of chapters 1 through 5, so don't worry about this chapter for the exam. And it's not due till Friday. Watch the short video. You guys are sort of getting the hang of it by now, I'm guessing. All right, so we're going to talk about the macroeconomic perspective. We went through the first 5 basics chapters where we learned about terminology, supply and demand, these sorts of things. So now we're going to start actually getting into the macroeconomic, and the two courses split off from each other. So first, we need to talk about how do we measure macroeconomics. How do we measure macroeconomic indicators? What are those macroeconomic indicators, etc. And the most important is GDP, gross domestic product. This is a very, very widely used measure. There are a lot of ways to sort of relativize it over time to make sure that you're measuring the same thing but controlling for inflation over time. So $1 in 1930 and $1 in 2020 are very different, right? And so by taking inflation into account into the GDP, we can you can sort of relativize them to make sure we're not talking about completely different numbers. You can also relativize across a population, right? So GDP is not a very good indicator. It just sort of tells you how big an economy is, but it doesn't tell you how big an economy is per individual in the economy, right? And so if you take the GDP and then you divide by the population, you get GDP per capita. And it's a much better indicator of sort of standard of living or the standard of development or however you want to conceive of it. But then, when you compare China's and America's economy, they're not all that different on the gross scale of just GDP. But when you look at GDP per population, America is probably 4 to 5 times as much GDP per capita as is in China, which is still a relatively poor country. So keep these things in mind. We have to relativize these numbers. So gross domestic product, GDP, the definition here in the book is the value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. There are a lot of important terms here in this singular definition. First, it's all final goods. This means that any of the beginner or intermediate goods are not being included. So when you say when you mine slag from West Virginia, say, and then you want to turn that into products, and so a company will buy the slag from the miners, but then they will turn it into, say, charcoal and lubricants for the industrial set. And then once they turn it into charcoal and lubricants and they sell those are the numbers that we are including in the final GDP calculations. We are not including the original purchase of the coal, right? Because it's just an intermediate good. It is not a final product being sold on market. So it's a very important concept you have to take in. We're also not talking about the black market. We're also not talking about sort of work that you do for yourself at home. So this includes stay-at-home moms and dads. This includes taking out the trash. This includes cleaning up your home. Now, if you hire a maid or someone to come in and service your home, then that would be counted in the final GDP product. But when you do it yourself, it just doesn't count, right? And there's some disagreement about why we don't count that, and is it respectful of women and men who are stay-at-home parents, but I honestly, I don't know how we would even calculate that. So it'd be a really difficult thing, and it would just be adding fake money to to our numbers, which doesn't make a lot of sense because then we couldn't compare it to other countries if they're not measuring the same. So I don't think the argument has a lot of merit, to be perfectly honest with you, but it is something that some have brought up. Okay, so we talked about final goods. It also is a country in a given year. So as easy as this seems, it is not as easy as it looks. Measuring the GDP of a country is relatively easy for a country like the United States or, let's say, France. They have determined who is a part of their nation. There are constitutional laws about that. There's not a whole lot of international argument about, whether the Seychelles are French or the Seychelles or whether, say, Nantucket Island is part of America, right? These are settled. Other countries don't have that luxury, right? So if you consider China and you think about Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are two enormous sort of microeconomies, do they count toward China's GDP? It would be a huge proportion of China's GDP. I'm guessing anywhere from 10 to 30% of their GDP would be the output produced by Hong Kong and Taiwan. But some argue that those are not Chinese entities, right? China argues that they are. Some of the Western cultures argue that they're not. This is a really difficult thing to try to understand. And you can see where this gets even more difficult, where countries who are trying to secede, or, parts of countries which are trying to secede, like the South Sudan, before they actually got international recognition as a new state, do we count that as GDP towards Sudan's GDP? I mean, there are a lot of questions about I guess, your sovereignty and your national integrity and your geographical integrity and what counts and what doesn't. So keep that in mind, all right? We probably won't touch on a lot of that, but it's good for you to be thinking about the difficulties of measuring these sorts of things. The GDP for the United States in 2014, which is the most recent sort of pure measure we have, was around $17.5 trillion. It's a lot of money, right? $17.5 trillion. There are two ways of measuring GDP. You have the demand side. We're going to add up all of the different things that are bought in the economy at the final stage of purchasing, right? And so if you look down below at figure 6.3, this is sort of the breakout of how we consider the demand side. So you have consumption, and consumption makes up the vast majority of the American economy and a growing proportion over time, which is important. We are a consumer nation. We don't really save a whole lot. As you can see at the bottom in the investment corner, our investments in America, and this is both business and individuals, is hovering at around 15 to 16%. That's not great, as we'll talk about later in the chapter. We like to spend money in America. And so the vast majority, and again, and growing, of the proportion of GDP in the United States is from consumption. Government expenditures make up around 20%, but this is slowly dropping, very, very slowly. And a lot of this is sort of the rights movement to minimize government. And so maybe we'll see this tick back up as the left, that is usually how it happens. The right sort of reduces government spending, the left increases it. Although that's not really true in modern times. If you look at the Bush administration, if you look at the Trump administration, they weren't exactly deficit hawks. So the spending doesn't change all that much. But I do think that we're probably going to see a big jump under the Biden administration as they sort of approach this economic and health problem combination with sort of an FDR type of approach. Lots of government spending, lots of government hiring to try to kick off the economy, that sort of thing. So I do expect it to sort of tick up a little bit. And then you'll see investment is at around 15%. And while this has been on the rise in the last, between 2010 and 2015 after the crash, I think we're going to see this dropping yet again as we see inequality in our system just expand dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. As we see a lot of people just sans jobs, this is going to be, we're going to see a downtick in our savings, I think. So at least theoretically, I think that we're going to see consumption reduce, investment reduce, government expenditures increase. So we'll start to close that gap a little bit. But just know that consumption is by far the vast majority of GDP output in the United States. And then you also have to take in the trade deficit, the trade balance into consideration. So if you look at that second graph, this is exports versus imports. You can see that our exports, while they're rising over time, they're not keeping up with our imports. So we as Americans tend to import more than we export. There are a lot of, especially politicians out there, who say that this is a bad thing and that we have to close this sort of the trade balance, and we need to be running a trade surplus, and it's bad for our economy. But I don't think most economists see it that way. I don't see it that way. I think it's sort of silly to look at it that way. We have excellent benefits that we derive as businesses, as government, and as individual consumers from purchasing abroad. It not only is helping them to increase their standard of livings abroad, but it is also helping to increase our standard of living, because we're paying very cheap prices for products that would cost a lot more if they were made in America. And so this is one of my concerns about the new push by the Biden administration to force the federal government to buy American. While, yes, this may help to create jobs, it also is going to cost more money, right? American products are a lot more expensive because American labor is more expensive, and there's no reason for Americans to be manufacturing things like T-shirts or pencils or pencil sharpeners, right? These are really low-end goods, and they should be outsourced to cheap labor. So I don't really understand the purpose. I understand the politics of it. It looks nice. It sounds nice. It won't necessarily be this great expansion of jobs or anything. And it may actually cost us more in the long run, because it's American products are expensive, period. And it's going to cost you more in the long run if we move just back to American products. There's a reason we outsource these things. They are cheap. Labor is cheap. It is cheap to build crappy little products that everyone needs, a billion of, but it doesn't make sense to do it in America because the taxes are high, the labor costs are through the roof in comparison. So, take this sort of thing with a grain of salt. The idea that running a trade deficit is necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily true. If I teach you anything in this class, it's just always be skeptical, right? And look deeper if you can. Don't ever trust something that comes out of a politician's mouth. There's a reason they're saying it. All right, so on the other end of GDP, we have supply. And just like on the demand side, the supply side is just another way of determining what the GDP is from sort of a backward perspective, right? So at this point, we're looking at non-durable goods, services, structures, and inventories. And these, theoretically, they should add up to that same $17.5 billion GDP for the United States, no matter how you calculate it, demand side or supply side. There are difficulties in that, right? There are data collection difficulties. So you're going to get some very slight variations, but it'll add up to about the same thing, right? That sort of plus or minus margin of error. But here, if we're looking at this, we've got durable goods. which America doesn't make much of. These are cars, these are long-term batteries, things of that sort. We have non-durable goods, which is sort of the stuff I was touching on earlier, like t-shirts, pencil sharpeners and pencils, these sort of very basic goods, intermediate products. And then you have structures, which is buildings, right? Schools, apartment complexes, things of that sort. And then services, which sadly is the vast majority of the American economy. We are a service economy. We are providing technological and human resource and other sorts of services like that. It's what are some services, right? Plumbing, electrical work, pest control, attorney work, all of these sorts of things that don't actually add much to the real economy. They don't actually produce a tangible product. So this is something that's concerning. Services as a proportion of the American economy have been increasing over time, and it's becoming more and more likely that you work in a service industry. America has lost manufacturing. A lot of this we touched on just a few minutes ago on, the cost of American labor, these sorts of things. But it is relatively concerning that we don't really produce anything in the United States anymore. Here below, if you look at figure 6.5, these are the type of services. So you can see that durable goods have remained about stable, structures have remained about stable, but it is reducing a little bit over time, especially due to sort of the death of brick and mortar and the rise of the sort of internet economy, that sort of thing. But then if you look at the top of the graph, you can see that services are just shooting through the roof over time as a proportion of GDP. So this is something that a lot of economists are a little bit concerned about, and we wonder how we can sort of move our economy back toward making at least a little bit more durable and non-durable goods to export to the rest of the world, or even to just sell to the American public. It's going to be a hard slog. It'll be a really difficult thing. There is some suggestion that the pandemic and the difficulties of getting our hands on the vital equipment that was necessary early in the pandemic, like N95 masks and respirators and things of this sort, because there was a glut of demand on the international market, it became very difficult to be able to source these products for our medical system. And so there are those on both sides, actually, who are talking about trying to declare some of these industries as national industries, right? As vital to national security. And so to sort of at least send some subsidies to companies that produce these things if they will produce them in the United States, so that in future, if we have another pandemic, which is nearly inevitable, that we will have access to these products that we couldn't source before in the first year of the Trump administration, because there was just not enough supply on the market. So that's something that needs to be considered, and something that economists are considered. It's something that the Biden administration is thinking about, is not nationalizing the industry, but declaring a nationally vital industry that we will support and help to bring back onto American shores. So I think we're going to get a readjustment of how we think about the ideas of comparative advantage, the ideas of outsourcing industries to take advantage of cheaper labor. There are some things we don't necessarily want to do that for, and we might want to keep on American soil, even if it is a little more expensive, right? Little food for thought. Again, black markets aren't considered in GDP, so anything from the drug market, anything from, say, like the underground gun market where you're just buying guns out of the back of someone's car or something, these things are not included, and there's no way we really could include them. There are government bureaucracies like the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, which makes annual suggestions or annual, what is the word I'm looking for here? Annual reports about how large the drug market is given some model that they've built or some algorithm that they've built, and they plug in all their data and all their busts for the year and the value of drugs, this sort of thing, and they can sort of tell us how large the black market is. It's not accurate. It's not counted toward GDP. So don't really think about that. Don't think about how big is the drug market and how is that affecting our GDP, because we don't think about it at all. There are some other. I guess I should say one more thing about black markets. They tend to be much larger in impoverished states or developing states. The other way around. They seem to be much larger in rich states. Now, there are more people generally participating in black markets in poor states, but there's more money flowing in the rich states, right? Because they have more money to spend. Most of the drugs that are used around the world are generally used in the rich countries. GNP is another possible measure of the economic output that happens within a state. We are not going to talk much about GNP in this course. GDP is generally the accepted measure of economic output. Now, is it the best? We'll talk a bit about that. It has some serious problems, but it is the one that's ubiquitous. It's the one that all economists have access to, and other social scientists. It's the one that's measured by every country across the world. So it's been sort of generally accepted that this is the measure we're going to use for development, or economic output, or whatever you want to say. GNP, the gross national product, it says here, it adds what is produced by domestic businesses and labor abroad, and subtracts out any payments sent home, these are called remittances, to other countries by foreign labor and businesses located. GNP is based more on the production of citizens and firms of a country, wherever they're located, and GDP is based on what happens within the geographic boundaries. Okay, so the GNP is based on your citizenry. So if you have this is difficult, right? Because some countries, say like Thailand or Vietnam, they have a lot of citizens, maybe anywhere from 10 to 15%, living abroad in places like Malaysia, in places like Qatar, or the United Arab Emirates, and they are basically traveling labor, and they live in camps. They help with, building buildings, building roads and infrastructure. They're often sort of domestic labor, cleaning houses and taking care of young children in these very rich countries, many of which have oil. And so GNP takes into consideration the fact that they are contributing to the Vietnamese economy, right? They're making money and they're sending it back home through what's called remittances. So Vietnam would count that as production for themselves rather than Qatar or Malaysia or whomever, or whichever country. I shouldn't say whomever, it's not a person. Those countries shouldn't really count this economic output toward their own country's output, right? In large countries, there's almost no difference between GNP and GDP. If you think about the United States, I mean, it's not like there's a lot of United States citizens living abroad, sending money back home to their poor families. I mean, it's just not really a thing. But in a lot of developing or third world countries, this is a major factor in their own economy, and remittances can be a huge proportion of their economic output, with people sending money back home. Then you have net national product. This is calculated by taking the GNP and subtracting the value of how much physical capital is worn out. This is depreciation. The idea of you want to depreciate the deterioration of physical capital. It's not all that influential. You have to imagine this is, if you look back up at what we were looking at earlier with structures, right? Structures only really make up about between 8 and 11% of the entire economy, and dropping. And so you're taking a small piece of that 8 to 11% of the economy and depreciating a tiny bit of physical deterioration over a year. This is going to have almost no net effect on the GDP, right? It's interesting, though. I worked in the appraisal district for a couple years as I put myself through graduate school, and this is something that we talked a lot about in the appraisal district, right? Because your taxes are based on your property, and if you can claim that your property is more physically deteriorated than it is, then you have to pay fewer taxes. And so there's this big fight every year about, how much depreciation do I get for my property? This is also sort of a tax haven trick that big companies, especially like CVS and Walgreens and apartment complexes and things like this, they basically will shunt all of their investments into these properties and then pretend like they're severely depreciated, and they'll write off all of those taxes. And so they're basically hiding the value of their money and pretending like it's not as valuable as it is. It's a big kind of a scam. And I know that it's sort of being reviewed at the SEC level. So it'll be interesting to see what the Biden administration does about this idea of being able to write off your tax depreciation as part of your tax, your tax balance. Okay. Adjusting nominal values to real values. We talked a little bit about this. This is section 6.2. We touched on this a tiny bit in the intro to the chapter. This is just the idea that the real value of a dollar, the nominal value of a dollar, right, in name is what nominal means. So $1 as named in 1930 and $1 as named in 2020 are not the same. They're just clearly not the same, right? And if you don't calculate for that, you have really messed up models, and you're going to be way overvaluing the money historically compared to today. And so if you look at this figure 6.9, the real GDP in, what is this, 1960 per capita, the real GDP is around $3 trillion versus, it looks like $500 billion, right? So that $500 billion in 1960 is equivalent to $3 trillion in today's terms. So if you want to compare over time, you have got to take the real value into consideration, and you have to adjust for inflation. That's the most important term here, inflation. Tracking real GDP over time. This is section 6.3. Recessions and depressions. So we should touch a little bit upon this. A recession is defined in the book really poorly as a significant decline in real GDP. That's a crap definition, period. We need a much more concrete definition. And so generally the American government measures a recession as 2 consecutive reductions in GDP in 2 consecutive quarters, right? So that's a 6-month period where we're getting reductions in GDP over 2 consecutive quarters. And that is sort of a data definition, much better than just significant decline in GDP. Like, what the hell does that mean? The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is one of the top sort of think tanks in the American government and the private side, the NBER, says the NBER measure of recession is a monthly concept that takes account of a number of monthly indicators: employment, personal income, industrial production, as well as quarterly GDP growth. Therefore, while negative GDP growth and recession closely track each other, the consideration by the NBER of the monthly indicators, especially of employment, means that the identification of a recession with 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth does not always hold. So, what that says is the NBER says it's even more precise than just 2 reduced quarters of GDP, right? It's not a good enough indicator. It's not precise enough. So they roll in employment numbers, personal income numbers, industrial production numbers, and GDP growth numbers. And they measure it monthly rather than quarterly. And they give you whether you're in a recession or not through there. So they don't exactly match up with the American government's definition of what is a recession, but it generally closely matches, okay? The NBER is also nice because it can sort of indicate that we are in a recession before that 6-month period is over, right? It's hard to have to wait 2 full quarters to react to something. And so if we can get much more precise indicators of whether our economy is slipping or not, it will give us some time to try to solve the problem rather than just sitting on it because we don't have any data for a whole quarter. And then a depression is just a lengthy and deep recession. And a depression really doesn't have a real definition. This is much more of a sort of crunchy granola sort of definition. Like, do you feel like it's a depression, right? Recession is a much more intricate economic term. Depression is more of a newspaper politician term, okay? Section 6.4, comparing GDP among countries. We should talk about 2 problems with this, right? The first is currency conversion. Japan uses a different currency than America, than Brazil, than Germany, than Russia, right? And so we have to figure out a way to equivocate all of these different things and relativize them. And we can do that through currency conversions. It's not perfect, but it's very close because there's trading literally every second on the market in these currencies. It gives us a better idea and a very precise idea of what these currencies are worth, right? And the second is population size. We talked about this earlier. The idea that China's economy and America's are about equivalent doesn't say anything about the vast differences in GDP per capita or the development of America versus China, right? Whereas, America's sitting at about $50,000 per person per year income. China's probably at about 6,000 to 10,000, right? So they got a long way to go. I also have added a list of the world's richest and poorest nations according to the Global Finance magazine. You have a link here that you can look at if you're interested. It's pretty interesting. America is not the richest country in the world. Not close, really. I mean, we're in the top 10. But we're not really close. Also, the poorest country in the world is wildly poor. I would suggest you look at it because it's really interesting how poor the poorest country on earth is. And I cannot imagine how you survive on that sort of money in a year's time. It is wild. So. I also kind of wanted to talk about some of my political science research and how development and GDP relate to democratization. Okay, and so I would say you all know what a normal U curve looks like, right? This is the relationship between development and democracy as well, according to Bloch and Stokes from 2003 in an article called Endogenous Democratization. Awesome article. They find that when you start to move from poorest and you start to make this transition into a more developed country, right? Very, very poor countries are almost never democracies. And if they do try to transition into a democracy, it almost always fails quickly, right? As you move in development up, okay, and you move from say $1,000 per capita per year to their limit was, I think, $6,055. Don't take that number, don't memorize that or whatever, but that was sort of their marker. They said once you hit that sort of $6,055 per person per year in your economy, you're much more likely to make this transition into democracy, and you're much more likely not to fall back into autocracy. Right? Does that make sense? So poor countries, anytime you try to transition, it generally doesn't work. As you start to move up the income ladder, your likelihood of transitioning to democracy increases, and your likelihood of slipping back into autocracy decreases. Now, if you get past the $12,000 mark, right, and you haven't stepped into being a democracy, you sort of avoided that push to free your political system and turn into a democracy, you basically will never become a democracy. So these are countries like Singapore, maybe China in the future if they can avoid this push from the bottom, right? These are countries like these where they have a lot of money, but they can basically just pay off their population. They have no incentive to try to democratize and try to free up that political power and hand it out to their people. They just stay an autocracy, and they're rich enough to keep themselves that way. And so the relationship between development and democratization is a U-curve. So in the middle, you're at the very low end of income. You are an authoritarian state, and you're likely to stay an authoritarian state. At the very high level of income, if you never transitioned into a democracy, you never will. Okay, but in that middle range of development, you're likely to become a democracy, and you're likely not to slip into autocracy. And so once you reach that really rich range, as long as you've transitioned already, you'll never slip back. Never, who knows, but we haven't seen any instances of it yet, really. So anyway, really interesting paper, really interesting findings about how development affects the likelihood of democratization, and it wasn't what people thought, right? People generally thought, well, if you develop, you're going to become a democracy. Look at Europe. That's not true. It's not true. Section 6.5, we'll touch a little bit on how well does GDP measure the well-being of a society. It's not great, right? There are some real problems in the fact that, first of all, it's an average, and averages get pulled by extremes. And so in America, we have some extraordinarily rich people, many of the richest people in the entire world, and it sort of pulls that average per capita income up and makes it look like we're richer than we really are. So if you take a median income rather than this GDP per capita, you get a much more precise look at where the average American stands, and it's less than that GDP per capita because all of these hyper-rich individuals are pulling the number up and making our numbers look better. GDP doesn't take in the idea of leisure time. So in Germany, they work about 400 hours on average less than an American. They have about the same GDP per capita, a little bit lower, but they also get 10 extra weeks of vacation. So how does that affect their well-being? And if we look at other indicators like the happiness index, America's not very happy, and we're angry, we're frustrated, we're politically pissed off, we're overworked, and so we're not really happy. And if you look at some of these other indices, it looks like countries like Germany, Norway, Finland, Sweden, even weird states like Bhutan, which is a monarchy, they are far happier people than we are. And a lot of that has to do with Americans just overwork themselves. Germans make almost the same amount of money and they're working 10 weeks per year fewer. So GDP does not take these things into consideration. What does you have money. How comfortable is your life though, right? And that's not really indicated by the GDP. Environmental cleanliness. This is another important thing that's not really taken into consideration by GDP. Maybe it will consider the expenditures in a single year of, say, cleaning up a lake or a river, and those will contribute to GDP, but it won't. The benefits derived from breathing clean air and drinking clean water and not having to spend that money in a hospital or emergency rooms might actually reduce your GDP. But again, is that a bad thing that we're drinking clean water and clean air and not spending more money in hospitals, right? I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think clean water and clean air are probably better than hospital expenditures. I guess from a purely economic perspective, I'm wrong, but again, this is a problem with the GDP. Inequality is another one that we've touched on a lot. There is extreme inequality in America. We're one of the most unequal nations on the planet. And I'm not talking about just the developed world or the OECD. I'm talking about the world. We are one of the most unequal places on the planet. And this affects standard of living. And while our GDP per capita may be high, there are a lot of people living in poverty. 1 in 4 children in America doesn't know where their next meal is coming from. We have homelessness all over the country. So these are real problems that aren't necessarily accounted for by our great GDP number, right? Another problem is that disasters can boost GDP, right? This is what we were talking about with sort of healthcare and clean water and clean air. If you get a massive tornado that rips through Montgomery, Alabama, and causes $6 billion in damages that have to be replaced, well, suddenly Alabama's GDP just increased by $6 billion. I mean, is that what we're trying to measure, though? I don't know if that's real economic output. And why aren't we sort of writing that off? Because it also just destroyed $6 billion worth of value. That sort of thing doesn't make a lot of sense. The book notes that GDP and standard of living track well over time, right? There is a pretty decent correlation between GDP and standard of living. It sort of falls apart once you start looking at just the developed countries, right? Because some developed countries like Germany, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, etc., Norway, they're just happier and healthier and more educated, but they have lower GDPs, right? So once you start to shorten the sample of just rich states, GDP doesn't work as well as a measure of standard of living. But if you're just looking across the entire world, sure, it of course is a better measure of standard of living than nothing. There are some problems, though, with this, is that this measurement isn't really working as well anymore. Yes, GDP keeps increasing per capita for countries like the United States and Europe, etc. But for the first time ever in history, really, this is actually leading to worse outcomes. We're getting worse life expectancy. We're getting higher rates of diabetes, and we're even seeing diabetes amongst young children for the first time on Earth. Inequality is rising dramatically. So there are some serious problems with this as a measure of standard of living. We will talk in the future about some other measures, like the happiness index I was talking about earlier, which I would suggest you go look at. It's really some interesting research. We will be using GDP, though. We'll talk about it a lot. But I need you to know there are some serious problems. That's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed. We went kind of long today. Everybody, I hope you're happy and healthy. Keep working hard, and be sure to get that test to me by next Friday, all right? Have a great day and enjoy your weekend.